Hello and welcome back to the second half of Module 13, 13b, on what's wrong with terrorism. So let's take a in-depth look at the notion of terrorism from an ethical and moral perspective. In 2002, this would be a year after 9/11, Thomas Nagel wrote an article called "What is Wrong with Terrorism?" and asks a very simple question. What makes terrorist killings any more worthy of condemnation than other forms of murder? And ultimately, the issue is a condemnation of means, not ends. Because the main difference between a terror attack is that it is something that we don't expect. There may be knowledge of something beforehand, if we're lucky, but it is something unexpected. It's suddenly someone pulling out a machine gun in a shopping mall and mowing down as many people as they can. That's a terror attack. But the means by which the attack is done is different than a country declaring war on another country. In other words, they have time to prepare, right? We don't have time to prepare. We don't know if there's going to be a terror attack somewhere. So the means by which the ideology is now sort of going to unfold in front of us. We need to be very mindful of how that is done. So declaring war on someone, the end result is still death. But a terror attack doesn't sort of give us that heads up, right? It just happens. So those who would condemn terror attacks, right, as means to an end, must also reject the ideology. Because the ideology behind terrorism is just that, to instill terror, to make people think that this could happen at any time. So when we are talking about terrorism as a plan of action, the balancing of cost versus benefits, right, it doesn't work, because what we're talking about here is the notion that a terror attack is, first of all, random. Second of all, it's unexpected. And three, it wishes to cause as much damage as possible to those people immediately there. But a far greater issue is to simply instill terror in that population, because we don't know if it's going to happen again. So the costs and benefits really don't apply with a terror attack like they do in wartime, where allegedly, depending on what kind of war it is, allegedly bombers plan very carefully. They try to avoid hospitals. They try to avoid shopping malls, places of worship, places where people will congregate. And this is the idea of war. But the fog of war, right, the first thing that happens is people don't think very, very carefully or think straight. So the end result is still death. But during wartime, the idea is that it's morally permissible, right, to not only kill soldiers and bomb munition depots, because those should be the ideal targets, but there will always be a degree of what's called collateral damage. And collateral damage is the killing of unarmed civilians. Those civilians who unfortunately are caught in the crossfire, have not been able to escape, have not made it to a refugee camp, all the places at least where individuals may feel somewhat safer than simply in the line of fire. So with terrorism, those things just don't happen. So if this is permissible, in other words, if collateral damage is permissible, then why is it wrong to aim directly at non-combatants, right? You and I, out shopping, out meeting friends, or just out in the street, especially if killing them may actually lead to a better chance of defeating the enemy. So what is the difference? What is collateral damage in a terror attack versus collateral damage during a wartime? So it is a side effect of combat, but in the end, do they not do the same thing? Do they not achieve the same ends? So that is something that is far more difficult to pin down, because collateral damage will occur during any war. And what we've seen lately is wars, for example, in the Middle East, in Syrian attacks on hospitals, Syrian attacks on markets, on educational facilities, the very places where people are going to congregate. Syrian forces have, in fact, attacked their own people. And this, again, is an altogether different kind of war, something that is unprecedented. But the notion of collateral damage Again, this is an official government that is recognized around the world, attacking and killing its own people by deliberately targeting hospitals. So collateral damage here now is very problematic because this is an alleged country, not a terror organization, but an alleged country with a government attacking its own people. So the notion of collateral damage is really at the heart of the issue between a terror attack and a wartime bombing, for example. And really what it boils down to is a difference between accidental and deliberate civilian deaths. Now that even in itself becomes problematic because if there is accidental death, and that is sort of the traditional idea of collateral damage, versus the deliberate death of civilians, that was the intention, right? The intention was to bomb this place. If that's the case, can we call the atomic bomb attacks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 as terror attacks by the US? Those were done deliberately. Okay, Hiroshima was a city of industrial and military significance. This is where the war machinery was being built. The bombers deliberately chose civilian targets. And this was after they had strafe-bombed Japan, and knowing that many of the buildings were made out of wood, basically firebombed it. Japan was basically on fire, and they were ready to surrender. And after they were ready to surrender, the atomic bombs were still dropped. So at what point does it stop being accidental death and deliberate death? So the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, again, render problematic the notion of deliberate and accidental civilian death, and also what constitutes a terror attack in and of itself, and a government-sponsored or state-sponsored deliberate killing of civilians. So, as you can see, it's not easy to sort of compartmentalize and say, yeah, that's one thing, that's something else. There have been numerous attacks, drone strikes in the Middle East, and whether Afghanistan or in Iraq, that have killed civilians because the drone strike mistook a wedding with 30 or 40 people for some kind of meeting of Al-Qaeda. And we know several times this has happened. More times, in fact, probably more times than we even know, because sometimes that kind of information is suppressed and censored. But we do know that drone attacks are not always completely successful. So those kinds of things we need to consider when we try to make that distinction between collateral damage as deliberate or accidental, because we can find examples of both. We can see governments acting in a deliberate fashion, not unlike terror organizations, but ultimately the difference with a terror attack is deliberate civilian deaths. Where it differs, and one can be one or the other, is in the kinds of government attacks that are done during wartime. Okay, so ultimately, the issue lies at the deliberate targeting and killing of unarmed civilians. And we would like to live our lives thinking that that's not going to happen. But times have changed, big time. We used to think that, we would not be killed. Remember the social contract, right? We enter into the social contract in the hopes that people will not kill us, harm us, violate us in some way. But it's kind of ancient history now. Because even if it's expedient to kill us, we would like to think that others look at us as having some kind of human value, our autonomy, our freedom, our selfhood. No, it's gone, right? That's what terror attacks go after. Because we think we have freedom, a terror attack is far more effective because it threatens our freedom. And if that is the case, then it has done its job in instilling fear in us to go out and do average normal things. So civilian warfare is something that does happen. In case you're just wondering here, this young boy is catatonic. He was pulled out of a hospital after being trapped for something like 3 or 4 days in a Syrian attack by government forces on their own people. And so one can only imagine what this little boy saw before he was rescued. He was catatonic. So when we were talking about these kinds of things, we need to be very careful as to, even if we declare war, civil or otherwise, what that government is actually doing. Are they deliberately targeting hospitals and educational centers and churches, or are they trying really hard not to? Well, if they truly are not aiming there, but munitions depots and bridges and things like that, okay, there is at least an attempt to minimize casualties. But when a government actively goes after its own population and bombs hospitals, they cross the line. That is a terror attack no matter what, because it's deliberately killing people. So we would like to live in a world, in a moral universe, where we try to minimize those civilian casualties. And we know in warfare that cannot be guaranteed not to happen. But a terror attack deliberately does this. It deliberately goes out to attack as many unarmed civilians as possible, right? That's why it's rarely happened where a terror attack takes place on an army base. And guess what? In the US, there was a terror attack on an army base. So even that area is not off limits. But at the very least, in terms of a liberal democratic world that we would like to live in, right, we owe fellow human beings some kind of moral imperative not to deliberately harm them. But terrorists don't operate under those conditions. It is the very fact that there is freedom in the West that often motivates the ideology of terrorists. But that's a whole other lesson. But here we just wanted to talk about the difference between deliberate and accidental civilian casualties. The clear difference, if we were to talk about a perfect world, and let's say World War II, and even World War II, the bombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden that killed thousands of civilians, the attack of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed, again, thousands of civilians, unarmed civilians. Even World War II, as idealized as we have made that war, there was an awful lot of targeted bombings. And it's targeted bombings that really cross a line when a government is issuing this, that they now are bordering on terror attacks. Okay, so that's the first half. Now, in the second half, we're going to be talking about terrorism, but in a very different way. We're going to talk about the fact that state-sponsored terrorism, is this a good thing? So David Lubin, this gentleman here, argued that torture used to be incompatible with American values. And we had a range of, whether it's the Bill of Rights or the Constitution or various legal precedents that said that we should not actively torture members of our own population and members of someone else's population. So the Convention Against Torture was brought in by the American Senate. There was anti-torture legislation. Even though certain states still have capital punishment, they at least decided that torture was dastardly and totally inhuman. It was a horrible thing. So there was consensus there that the use of torture officially, right, remember, officially, should not be used. So what happened? Well, 9/11 happened. And everything went out the window. Now, I don't know if many of you are old enough to remember 9/11. You would have been very young. I would have been 41 when it happened. So I remember like it was yesterday. I was working a night shift and crawled into bed in the morning. And boy, did life change that afternoon when I got up. So September 11th, 2001 changed everything. And what it did change, probably more than anything else, is public opinion regarding the use of torture. Because now the ironically named Patriot Act included that, the possibility of state-sponsored torture. And this Patriot Act, was completely counterintuitive to everything that America had stood for up to this point. And so the notion of liberalism, as we saw first in John Locke, I mean, more so in Locke than in Hobbes, but the notion of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, Rousseau's, notion of freedom, all of these things gone out the window. And so the attack or the torture of terror suspects basically was right across the board, because the context in which this thing was signed was you're either one of us or you're one of them. So opinion was already galvanized. And so for Democrats as well as Republicans, because Republicans were in power at the time. George W. Bush Jr. was running the government at the time, so it was a Republican government right across the board. Very few people dissented for the very reasons that we're going to discuss, but overall, it was agreed to that this was not a bad thing. Now, in the meantime, torture is still being used. But what makes torture such a horrible thing, something I would never wish to experience or even be threatened to experience? As you can imagine, the reason why torture is so vile is because of the very, very unequal relationship between the torturer, who has been given a green light by the government to go ahead and inflict harm, possibly death on that person. It cannot be more unequal. And let's face it, the individuals that are dragged into these torture rooms are blindfolded, handcuffed, or they're handcuffed around their legs as well. They can't get away. And even if they could, where would they go? If they're being held in Guantanamo Bay, so you escape and go where? It's a long way to swim, right, to get home. So in this isolated place, behind closed doors, with full autonomy, zero accountability, that unequal relationship between the torturer and the tortured begins. First of all, the victim is isolated, and any notion of their humanity is gone. They're typically just a number. They may not even know these people by name. So you're isolated. You have no legal recourse. You have no one to protect you, no one to say enough, in other words. So you're isolated in that way. You're overwhelmed by extreme pain, whether it's waterboarding or something worse. You're terrorized by either very real or at least implied pain, implied panic. And often part of the torture is simply displaying these instruments of torture and you not knowing what they're going to use. That in itself would be overwhelmingly terrorizing. And finally, the humiliation of the victim by just physically and mentally breaking them, by just breaking their spirit, breaking their soul, breaking their will to live. All these things dehumanize people. And guess what? We know we can do it because we had concentration camps in Germany that worked very, very efficiently because of the bureaucracy that surrounded it. Once you tattoo a number on someone, they are no longer a person. They are merely a number. And numbers of units, right, can be moved around and anything can be done to them. So that's part of what torture is all about, is you isolate the victim, you overwhelm them with pain, you terrorize them with more implied pain, and then finally you break them. You break their spirit, you break them as human beings. So those are all the things that liberals at one point hated, because it destroys the notion of a human being, an autonomous human being with selfhood and dignity. It didn't matter. And so you end up with a situation that certainly throughout history has been around, because we do know that in ancient Greece, the victors' torment of captives, beheadings and enslavement and all kinds of horrible things. Yeah, because one group won, they can inflict harm and pain and death upon the other. Who's going to stop them, right? Who's going to stop them? So that's one thing. There was also the use of torture against political figures, and also to terrorize the population in general into submission. The very fear of the Stasi secret police in Eastern Europe, or the secret police in Romania, the secret police in Russia, in Syria. And these people, you knew you couldn't talk to anybody, because if you were hauled away, you were very likely never seen again. But before you finally die, you would go through a world of pain. And guess what? No one there to protect you. No one there to hear your screams. Because who are you going to turn? Who are you going to turn to? The police? Oh, right. They're the ones actually breaking your legs. Okay, yeah. So torture also used to be used as a form of criminal punishment before an execution. This is, again, the final humiliation, where the prisoner, depending on what they did, treason, murder, kidnapping, rape, whatever, would be publicly tortured. And people would cheer it on, and which is a pretty sickening sight, as you can imagine. So all these things meant that torture had been used before. It had been used in terms of a government sponsorship, because it's not just anybody that publicly tortures and executes someone. The government does. And so the government, whether it's in ancient Greece or whether it's in Syria or Eastern Europe, or Russia, torture is a form of punishment before execution. Those things meant that torture has been used for thousands of years. Okay, now where it matters and where the notion of torture might be beneficial is the last one, is this one here. Torture used to extract confessions from criminal suspects. Now, again, let's be careful with this one, because when we are trying to extract a confession from someone, what happens with the use of torture on terrorist suspects is it becomes rationalized by saying, look, rather than trying to look backwards to extract a confession, why not look forwards to try to forestall a future attack? So we'll do the same thing, but this time we're not, if they confess to a previous crime, fantastic, that's just gravy. But what we're looking for is intelligence. Can we stop another attack by harming this person just enough that they will fear losing their life and will start to talk? So torture is a technique of intelligence gathering rather than extracting a confession, becomes the way in which the government rationalizes the use of torture. So it looks forward to future events. And of course, if they're successful, and the jury's out on that, you may or may not stop a future attack. So if you are going to do that, if you're going to try to use torture to extract information that will be beneficial to halt a future attack, it comes with its qualifiers, we'll say. And there's a bunch of them. The four main ones is the first one, right? If you begin to torture someone, and if you are trying to save lives, you're looked at as somehow a kind of hero. And the TV series, for example, 24, was famous for that. Kiefer Sutherland's character, I don't even know, Jack something or other. Anyway, worked for the CIA, FBI, it doesn't matter. It's a Homeland Security, something like that. Point is, the viewer of the television program saw and knew that the person that was being punched in the head or tortured was guilty, right? We saw them blow up, a building or do something awful, and was the one responsible for the terror attack. So we rationalized the fact that, we'll call him Jack, I think that's his name. We can rationalize the use of torture against this person because we know irrefutably that that's the person responsible for that attack. So, well, he got what he deserved. But we don't know. We're torturing someone and we don't know. So to torture someone becomes a kind of heroic act. Something you want to make a movie about because you're now saving lives, right? And you're torturing someone that may or may not have information. So imagine you torture 3 or 4 of them and none of them know what's going on because they truly don't, right? Imagine the 5th one. You're getting pissed off. You're like, nobody's talking. That 5th guy, that 5th person you're going to torture, you're likely going to kill them because you're so frustrated you're getting no information that you are going to go overboard and kill them almost right away. Are you any further? No. You have no information because you don't know whether you've got the right person. So you're torturing this person and this heroic act is going to save lives, maybe. And what's more insidious, more evil, is that the motivations behind torture to extract information for a future attack becomes rationalized and it becomes normalized, becomes something that you just do. We have a group of people that we suspect that they are terrorists, so we're going to torture them with the rationality that we're going to we may get some information. So you start doing this, and for all the reasons that I just described before, that you isolate and overwhelm the victim, the act of torture as a heroic thing becomes dissociated from cruelty and suffering, because you're dealing with that person in that orange jumpsuit, and you are harming them, but you're harming an idea. You're harming a thing. You don't know that person's name. You can certainly hear their screams, but you really don't know who they are. You just know that they may have information. So you dissociate from the cruelty you're inflicting on this person to this somehow higher ideal that you have of gathering information. And then finally, the focus is shifted away from the victim to the torturing hero. So the hero that is inflicting all the pain is now kind of the star of the show. And the victim is just simply a prop, right? Well, this is how I got information. We talked to these people. Sure, enhanced interrogation is what it does. Again, talk about soft language. Enhanced interrogation is what this was called. And we don't know how many people have died at the hands of individuals that are busy with enhanced interrogations. But ultimately, the way in which liberals were kind of convinced that torture might be okay as a way to gather information to stop future attacks was this ticking bomb scenario. And this was something that, okay, look, if this is the case, then we can sort of reevaluate the use of torture, because this was the liberal position, right? Not to use torture. It was inhuman, violates a person's freedom and autonomy and selfhood and, happiness for sure. But it was now sort of a different perspective. We're not looking to extract a confession and get this person to say, yes, I did so and so. You're looking to get information about something that may or may not occur from someone who may or may not know something. So if you now envision the ticking bomb scenario, which is, there could be an attack imminently, it now casts the torture and the act of torture in a more humane and a more heroic light. And when you do that, again, you now can rationalize it. So that ticking bomb scenario is a kind of slippery slope, right? We're just going to keep torturing people more and more until we get that information that we think is out there. So the authorities, right, they capture a person or a group of people that they suspect may or may not know something. Okay, so you have a group of people and you begin to torture them in the hopes that you may be able to find some information and you may save some lives. But if there's a 1 or 2% chance, do you torture just one of them and say, I don't think they know? Or do you torture all of them? Because guess what? You have no accountability. You are almost anonymous because you're simply doing a job. You know somebody's got your back because you're doing it legally. You're doing it in isolation in some sort of black prison, who knows where, working on behalf of the CIA. What are the chances of getting information? Well, it's 1 in 1,000. We don't know, because those people that we have now captured may or may not know something. So whether you have one person or a group of people, where do you stop, right? Where do you stop? Because it becomes a kind of fishing expedition. Oh, let's just keep on torturing people till we get something. And we don't stop there because, we haven't found the information. So we keep on looking and we keep on torturing to try to get something. So the worst part about this ticking bomb scenario and how liberals have been sort of bought into it, because again, it's forward-looking, trying to stop a future attack, to gather information, at the very least, right? It ignores legal practices and procedures. Due process, innocent until proven guilty. All of these things are gone. So the legal system literally just kind of stands aside and says, I ain't getting involved in this. You're on your own. But the fear is, and the terror is that it's state-sponsored. Who are you going to call, right? You can't call the police or the army or the CIA or the FBI. They're the ones doing it. So it is very terrifying. So the one hand, the first issue is the ticking bomb scenario allows us to rationalize the use of torture to gather information. The second one is that it ignores legal practices and procedures that are entrenched in our laws. But somehow we treat terrorist suspects as different because they don't obey our laws and respect autonomy and freedom and the pursuit of happiness, then we can do the same to them. And that's how we rationalize that as well. So we have to talk about this ticking bomb because it becomes much more serious because there is no accountability. How do you properly train someone to torture another individual? And the few people that I've spoken to that either used to be in the army or know of people that have done this, it's psychologically damaging. Because I couldn't imagine being the person inflicting pain on someone else and hearing their screams and then going home and hugging my kids. I don't know how that can be done. And guess what? The army can program people to kill, but I don't think they do such a good job as deprogramming people and allowing them to deal with what they've done. That's a far more difficult thing to do. And we, again, are not looking at this. In the States, for example, members of the CIA and the FBI have left the Bureau because they don't want to participate in it, because it has messed them up. And the PTSD that they suffer as a result of it is never discussed. It's never talked about because somehow it's just not important. So if we were to allow this to happen, right, what we would end up with is what's called a torture culture. And the torture culture eventually normalizes the notion of torture. Now, in Eastern Europe, in certainly East Germany, Romania, and other sort of Soviet satellite nations back in since the Second World War till 1989, when everything fell apart, there was the secret police. And people were terrified of speaking to one another about anything that was remotely connected with politics, because you didn't know whether your next door neighbor was a member of the Stasi or some member of the secret police. The same in the Middle East, especially in Syria. So torture was normalized. People were terrified of speaking out. And anybody that protested were putting themselves in harm's way, because by normalizing torture, you allow the government to simply scoop you off the street, haul you off into a jail somewhere that you don't even know, your parents, your family do not even know where you are, and they go to work on you. And very often you die. Nobody is accountable. So when we normalize culture, right, we create this terror culture or torture culture, my pun there, a torture culture, then this kind of behavior becomes normal. It has been rationalized. So, and if that is the case, if you normalize torture, then it becomes even more difficult to enforce accountability. Just doing my job, right? Just doing what I was told to do. Now, how does something like that even happen? How would we even be on the road to a torture culture? And there's two reasons. There's two ways in which this happens. One is the nature of bureaucracy, and the other is a kind of social psychology that allows us to basically follow orders. So those two things become factors that allow the state-sponsored use of torture against terror suspects without people getting their hands dirty. And so the decision makers, the person who decide who gets tortured, they're not down there listening to the screams, right? They're not in the dark. They're not the ones handling those weapons and those tools of pain. The torturer simply is acting on behalf of decisions made by someone else. So there's the bureaucracy of it. And so if that happens, those people that choose who will be tortured never get blood on their hands. So the degree of accountability and degree of who does what, that's all done in a bureaucratic system. So bureaucracy is perfect for this kind of behavior. And sure enough, in Germany, during the Second World War and the running of the concentration camps, between the rail lines and bureaucracy, it was a well-oiled machine. So let's be careful when we agree to that. And so finally, in terms of social psychology, we simply do as we are told. And when we judge right and wrong according to what we consider to be normal, if we shift away to this kind of thinking of normalizing torture, in the same way that racism and sexism has now been sort of normalized in the US over the last 4 years, and hopefully it will disappear. I really hope it will. But when we start normalizing racism and sexism and violence, then we no longer care. The society is what it is. And it is a violent and inherently racist and sexist culture that condones the torture of terror suspects. And if that is the case, how can we expect someone that is conducting the torture to feel guilty? They're just following orders, right? That's what social psychology tells us, that we will follow orders no matter what, especially if the person that is giving them, is in a position of authority. So, key points. Central idea is prohibition against civilian casualties. We're talking about collateral damage. And what makes, this is also torture here. What makes a torture so awful is the degree of isolation, overwhelming the victim, terrorizing the victim with his pain, and then finally breaking them, humiliating them physically and mentally. And then finally, the only rationale for using torture today, and this is what we saw in shortly after 2001 with the Patriot Act in the U.S., was the fact that it could be a technique to use to gather, again, technique, enhanced interrogation, right? It's still torture, but it would be a technique for intelligence gathering in order to forestall, if not stop altogether, future attacks. But when we do that, we make heroes out of the torturers. We rationalize torture itself. It becomes dissociated from pain and cruelty. And all of a sudden, the act itself focuses not on the victim, but on the person doing the torturing, because they are a hero, right? They're going to stop the next attack, maybe. And finally, the way in which this is done or rationalized is through this notion of a ticking bomb scenario, right? That there's a bomb somewhere and this person knows, and we've got to get that information. If that is the case, then we begin to normalize this kind of behavior. And we normalize this kind of degree of violence, then we normalize violence across the culture, right? Across that society. And so we start to accept violence as just a normal response. Because let's face it, in the US, sure, they might be intelligence gathering, but there was a degree of revenge against these terror suspects that clearly informed what was going on and the decisions to even use torture in the first place. And instead, maybe striking up a rapport with these individuals and dealing with them as people to kind of figure out how their minds work. How did you get to this place? And work on them that way until finally they feel good about telling you probably legitimately useful information. Because I would think that if I were being tortured like anyone else, then you would start, singing like a canary as quickly as possible and tell them whatever you think they want to hear. Is it valuable? Is it legitimate? Is it helpful? No, it's just information. And guess what? If someone lies, the next person is going to be tortured. If they know they've been lied to, that person will get it even worse. So it's awful. So there it is, the last module of this course on ethics in society. Yes, a very heavy duty one, and one that I know many of you feel very strongly about on both sides. And when I read your papers, and I have a few left to go, I think about 13, even if you agree with it, if you persuade me and your argument is legitimate and solid, absolutely, I'm going to say very good paper. So yeah, I kind of have told you where I sit in this kind of behavior. But regardless, if you write a persuasive paper promoting and saying that this kind of behavior is correct, if you do it persuasively, that's a very good paper. Okay, so this is it. So we're going to meet again this week on Wednesday and Thursday for sections 40 and 41. But in the meantime, any questions, please contact me, and we will talk to you soon.